Hi, welcome to Ultimate Wildlife Gardens. I'm Chris Caligari. Part 1 of the deep dive onto wildlife ponds dealt with the basic business of constructing a pond, but now we move on to the exciting bit, setting it up and the ecology behind it. If we take a jar of water from the pond, it looks very uninteresting, but in actual fact, if you look at it under the microscope, it is absolutely teeming with life. And this life we need to introduce as quickly as possible. So let's assume, for practical purposes, that you have built your pond from new. You've probably filled it from the tap via a hose, which is the normal way of pulling the liner in. The first thing to do is nothing at all. A couple of days, I would say, to let the chlorine come out of the water, let the temperature equilibrate. Then you're ready to start introducing stuff into the pond. Now the best way to do that is to go to a neighbour, a friend, perhaps a natural pond that you know of, a well-established pond, and what you want to do is get yourself a bucket of water from the pond. Some of this wonderful stuff. What you're doing really is going to seed your pond. So having left it for a couple of days, then you're going to get a bucket of water from your established pond, pour it in, and there's going to be stacks of different types of microorganisms in there. Microorganisms, non-visible organisms, and they're essential to seed the pond. They will come in naturally in time, but you want to accelerate that process. I would also take another bucket, and if I can, try and get some mucky sludge from the bottom of the pond and put that in too. Again, you'll be introducing all sorts of species. You'll hear quite a lot of bird noise going on. That's the hedge sparrows nearby. They got young at this time of year. Right, so having got your pond seeded, then it starts to get interesting, because what you'll have done is introduced from your sample, from your pond, all sorts of, particularly important are the single-celled algae, because these are the primary producers in your pond. They'll breed up. Don't be alarmed if when you first set your pond up, it turns very green. That is actually a very good thing, because there's lots of photosynthesis going on with these little algae, these microscopic algae, and they of course are the primary producers. They're going to have things which feed on them, you're going to have bigger things which feed on them, and so we're starting to establish some food chains. Also, what's quite likely to happen, an early colonizer will be mosquito and midge larvae, all sorts of flying insects which will lay their eggs in there. So you're likely to get what seems like a mass, thousands upon thousands of insect larvae which will be flitting around in a zigzag way, and this is excellent. You want that. Don't worry about it, because look at it upon two ways. First of all, those larvae are going to turn into insects, and those insects are going to be food for the bats, for the spiders, for the swifts, for the swallows. So there's an excellent food source. Also for your pond, there are going to be animals coming in which are going to feed on those. On flight, many insects will find your pond really quite quickly. I'm thinking things like diving beetles and water boatmen, damselflies, dragonflies. They'll find it and they'll start to lay their eggs in there as well. And of course, you're starting to breed up food sources for them. So it takes a while. So if it turns green, if it's full of larvae, if this, if that, don't worry to start with, because this is part of the balance which has got to be achieved. This pond here represents a hugely complex ecosystem, and the checks and balances take a long time to establish. This pond is very unlikely to get great big fluctuations of populations of one thing or another, because certain species will rise in number, the predators which feed on it are also going to rise. It reaches a stable situation, which is just what you want. Excellent. Right, a primary early consideration is oxygenating plants. You want to get those in as early as you can. The perfect, I think, oxygenating plant is the hornwort. It's a native pond species, and it oxygenates very well. I tend to call it the bottlebrush weed. It looks very much like a bottlebrush, and that is the typical British native species that you want. Okay, it's not an ideal world. I often talk about what we should be aiming for. In actual fact, I have got the hornwort in here, but in addition, I have something which is actually non-native, but is found throughout the British Isles, very, very common, and that's Elodea, which is also a very good oxygenating plant, and most ponds actually have it. In an ideal world we wouldn't. This pond has stacks of Elodea as well. So although it's not native, it's not the ideal plant, and perfectly speaking, I would just have something like the hornwort in here. I have got Elodea, and actually it does a fine job. It's a bit like grey squirrels, you know. They're in the environment we wish they weren't here, but they are. You might be able to pick up the sound of a wren, which is also nesting close by here. Sorry about the interference in the wildlife. What a nuisance. Okay, so we've introduced our microorganisms, our microscopic organisms. There'll be things like water fleas, which will be feeding on the tiny algae. There'll be lovely food chains building up. Now let's turn our attention to the plants. Well, you can see on this pond I've got quite a few lilies. The native British lily is a very large plant and perhaps not suitable for a smallish pond. You can perhaps observe the cat in the background as well. Now, I have got several lilies here which I bought from a garden centre at various times. I've actually got 4 lilies in here, and although I'll be dealing with management and problems with ponds later on, an important principle when you're setting your pond up is that you really do want quite a high proportion of the surface of the pond covered with something like lilies. That provides protection for lots of the animals that live in there, but particularly important, it stifles some of this stuff, which is blanket weed. You can see I've got plenty of it. This stuff, it's filamentous algae. I've never had a pond without it. I'll deal with problems with ponds in a separate video, but this is almost bound to come in. It thrives on several things, but it needs a lot of light. So if you cut down the amount of light which enters your pond in the form of lilies or similar, you're going to reduce the problem with blanket weed. But really, as sure as eggs is eggs, you are going to get blanket weed. I'll deal with that at another time. It has got some pluses in that In here I have all 4 species of British newts, and it does give them a certain degree of protection. I've never seen anybody say this anywhere, but occasionally I have things like ducks visit and they will take the newts. So having some blanket weed in here does actually, I wouldn't say I love the blanket weed, but it does perhaps give the newts a little bit more protection from the ducks. Also, the way I've constructed the pond, it has lots of niches, so they have got lots of places to hide. Right, let's turn on to other plants. Could I add at this point, one thing to be a little bit careful of is where you get your water, your oxygenating plants, because often you will say to a friend who's got a pond, can I have a bit of oxygenating plant to start my pond? And that's great, but it's ideal if you can try and avoid ponds which have fish in them, because inadvertently, however careful you are, you're likely to bring young ones, eggs, etc. And in a wildlife pond like this, the last thing you want is exotic species. You don't really want fish in here. There are good oxygenators in your pond are things like the milfoil and the water violet. They're British natives and excellent oxygenators. They'd be a pretty good bet, but generally speaking, for oxygenating, I tend to rely on the hornwort and allodia. When I'm talking about covering the surface of the pond to cut down the light to reduce the blanket weed, it also obviously gives places for the tadpoles to get underneath and the damselflies and dragonflies to lay eggs. That's great. I would tend to avoid duckweed. I have got a little bit in here growing in places, and it doesn't seem to be too much of a problem. It can be a real problem because it can over-proliferate. For some reason, it tends not to in this pond. Okay, now we've got the marginal plants. In my pond, I've got several. I've got watermint, which is excellent. I've also got marsh marigold, which is a lovely plant, excellent for pollinators, very attractive, and also here ragged robin. They seed themselves down here. They cope perfectly well, but they do like very damp conditions. Other marsh plants you might include globe family from the buttercup family, pillwort, and Brooklime veronica. Very attractive plants. They're really marsh plants, but the ones that really like to be planted in baskets are things like the water forget-me-not, the watermint, which I mentioned. I've got some behind me. Bogbean is a very attractive plant which likes to form floating mats on the pond, attractive flowers. And another one is, which is related to the buttercup family, is the spearwort, which is a very attractive plant. It's rather like a buttercup flower. In my pond here, I've included an area for marsh plants. This is the marsh marigold, which is going to seed now. Obviously I'll let it seed. I've also got, going to seed again, is the ragged robin. Both beautiful plants. And to form this, I've actually used a bulk bag, the sort of bag that builders get sand delivered in. I've built a little wall, set the bag in to contain the soil, but we'll let the water go in. So the roots, the feet, the roots of these plants, are actually in pond water, and I filled it with subsoil. So these sort of conditions, I have my marsh marigolds, I have the ragged robin, and I also have, not out in flower at the moment, ladies smock. They like these conditions. Ladies smock, a particularly good plant. It's one of the food plants of the orange-tipped butterfly, and so I like to include that where I can. This I let go really to give a fairly naturalistic effect, but it does provide an added habitat for my pond. It works quite well. It's a little bit experimental, but it seems to work quite well. And this is the third year that I've had the marsh marigolds coming up, so I think they're fairly happy. Other plants we might include here would be the globe flower and the pillwort and the brookline veronica. Very attractive plants. There's quite a good range, and you can get these sort of plants, all of them I think without exception, from my mate Joel Ashton. He's got a channel, a very successful channel on YouTube, and I'll put the details on the captions on the video. But he will be able to supply most or all of the plants that I've mentioned. Right, so having got the pond established, I would then leave it for a while. I would not at this stage, in the early stages, when I'm just introducing my oxygenating plants, my marginal plants and marsh plants, I'd give it probably a season before I start thinking about introducing, let's say, frog spawn into the pond. Now, a note of caution, the wildlife trusts I've seen saying, don't take spawn from another pond to seed your own pond. That's basically because it's thought that you might transfer diseases from one place to another, which I think is a valid point, and I would be the last person to disagree with anything that they say. But I think there is a case for introducing spawn into the pond once it's well established. A couple of things to note particularly though. I would avoid taking just one mass of spawn. This is being a bit of a purist, but I would prefer to take a bit of spawn from one clump, a bit of spawn from another clump, because we want our frog population to have a good mix of DNA. And if we just introduce one clump from the parents, it's not ideal. So therefore, I would probably introduce spawn from several clumps if it's at all possible. I have tried it in this pond, but a mixed blessing. I have a healthy population of great-crested newts, which are a very much endangered species, but they're voracious feeders on frog spawn. And when I put the spawn in, within 24 hours, they'd eaten every bit of it. So I've been reluctant to do that again. I have a good breeding population of great-crested newts. I'm not going to interfere with that. I would very much like frogs. I'm hoping they will come in. But if you haven't got many frogs in your area, it can take a very long time before they start breeding in your pond. So I think there is something to be said for introducing spawn, frog spawn, toad spawn, if you can get it. The newts hopefully will come in on their own. But I don't think there's any harm once the pond is established. I keep stressing that because if your pond is not really fully established, I think it's unfair to introduce species in there where perhaps the food sources aren't sufficient for them. Okay, that's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour of of getting your pond established. If you've enjoyed the video, I'll be most grateful if you would click the like button, the thumbs up. If you would share it, that would be great. And if you'd subscribe to the channel, I'd be most grateful. Further videos in this series will cover problems with ponds, because you do get them now and again. I'll be talking particularly about blanket weed, about ducks, about herons, a few other little things which are bound to crop up, and from my experience as a landscaper, I hope I'll be able to point you in that direction. Of also, if you have problems with leaks in ponds, how to deal with them. I've done it several times in my capacity as a landscaper. Not easy, but it does crop up now and again, and it's as well to understand how to deal with it. A further video, which I haven't made yet but will be forthcoming, is talking about how to take your pond to the next level. So if you have a wildlife pond, how can you increase the benefit to wildlife beyond just the pond itself? That's enough waffling from the old boy. Thanks ever so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time. See you again. Bye.